This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. The episode is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. And this is a great collection of books about animal studies. Two things to know about the series is that it covers the whole disciplinary range of animal studies and, unlike a lot of academic books, it's actually very affordable. So do take a look at the website and see what kinds of books I've been publishing. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to a returning guest. I first met this person over a decade ago. Indeed, he might genuinely be the first academic whose work focuses on animal-related issues that I ever met in person. Dr. Steve Cooke is an associate professor of political theory in the School of History, Politics and International Relations at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. He works on the ethical and political status of animals, including questions about law-breaking and violence on their behalf. Today, we're going to talk about his new book, What Are Animal Rights For?, which was released in 2023 by Bristol University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for making me feel really ancient.
Can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
I guess it's several things. The first thing, obviously, the easy answer is that the publisher asked me to write it. And I like the series and the editor, right? So this is it's part of a new series by Bristol University Press that's about addressing the kind of challenges that we face. So it was different from the sort of introductory animal rights books that you'd normally get. This series is asking people who are working on topics, so that it started out with questions like, what are animal rights for? What is war for? What is philanthropy for? But they're about advancing arguments and addressing challenges rather than just explaining. And that was quite appealing to me. And it's appealing because it addresses some of the problems that I've encountered myself when I speak to students and members of the public and that I see in my own research. And that is, for example, when you talk to people about rights, they get very confused. Right? It's really difficult to explain what a right is to people and for them to understand how moral rights work and where they come from and the origins of them. And so I wanted to be able to write something to non-academics that could help answer questions about what animal rights are, how they function, what's the source of them, the justification. And the second thing is about addressing a problem that I've encountered in literature around moral psychology, which is about how we go about reasoning and the kind of futures that we can imagine. And it's quite difficult for people to imagine radically different futures, simply because our brains just are quite limited. We're amazing, sophisticated creatures, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to reason about worlds that are very different from ourselves, and that makes moral progress difficult. And so I wanted to give people a helping hand with that, to do some of the work imagining the future for them. So this book is both about making reasoning easier for people and explaining what rights are for and where they come from. And that's the key inspiration. I want to talk to people outside of the university about what a future with animal rights might look like.
So why talk about, or what's important about rights rather than, say, duties or virtues?
Oh, duties. Now, duties is probably, would be the easier one, right? I in the past, I've often tried to avoid talking about rights simply because it's difficult and opted for the language of duties sometimes. But I think partly it's because, our political and our legal institutions are all structured around a combination of rights and duties. It's very hard to talk about duties without talking about rights because they're the other side of rights. So it might seem easier, but as soon as you start working on it, you find that the other side is rights and you have to talk about rights. But we've got those structures, those institutions, those frameworks already in place. And I think a world in which animals have the kind of strong protections that I think they should have for their interests is just one that fits with a rights framework. Now, virtues you could talk about as well, and they're part of the story. Rights I see as sort of minimum standards. That's what makes a society just or unjust, is whether or not people's fundamental rights, in this case non-human animals as well, their fundamental rights are respected. But that's not the whole story. We could have a very just world that's also really boring, for example, right? Or people might not respect rights for the right reasons. They might do so grudgingly. And I think a better world is one in which people respect rights for the right reasons, and that's a good world to live in. So I think there's a place for thinking about our character, the kind of attitudes we have, our dispositions, as well as rights. And I do talk about that towards the end of the book as well. It isn't just about rights.
You start the book with an intellectual history of animal rights. Now, I don't think of you as an intellectual historian. I hope you think that's a fair characterization of
Very
you.
much so.
So why do you think it's important to have this historical lens? What can it add to the conversation?
One of the reasons I talk about the history of animal rights is because people are interested in it. It's really interesting. And so it's a good way to get people in, to help them think about the issue, because historically people have been grappling with the same ethical problems we grapple with now. And if we look at the way they try and solve their problems, the kind of discussions they have, we can go a long way to solving them for ourselves at the same time. Now, I'm very conscious that I'm not an intellectual historian or any kind of historian, and so I'd be, wary of doing intellectual history. When I started working on the book, the first thing I did was spend a fair bit of time talking to some historians and looking at how historians approach the field. And partly I did that because I've read quite a few books that have histories of animal rights written by animal rights philosophers. And you can easily spot the difference between one of those and a book written by a historian. There's a tendency, even a temptation, to focus on dates and the big names, and you end up with a great man story. And I wanted to try and avoid that as much as possible. But yeah, I have to bear in mind that this is somebody else's field I'm blundering into. But I hope I've made it interesting, at least, and drawn out some of those key arguments and ideas that not just philosophers, but other kinds of thinkers have grappled with over time.
Did you find there was more history than you expected there to be when you started digging?
I was surprised, I think, at how hard it was to identify rights-based claims further back. Now, there are lots of things that look like animal rights claims very early on across different cultural traditions, and particularly in sort of Greek thought, there's references to justice and concepts like that. But it's been very interesting to discover how much disagreement there is amongst actual historians of ideas about whether they count as rights claims, what the different ways of thinking about core concepts like justice and law and rights actually meant in different contexts. So I wasn't surprised about the sort of breadth and how far back the kind of arguments went, but it was interesting to see how the language had changed. And there is very much a much stronger focus on character, dispositions, virtues across all sorts of different cultures. You see it in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Confucianism, in the history of the Greek intellectual thought, all the way up until we start getting the sort of natural rights tradition starting to appear in Europe in the sort of 1700s.
So you mentioned earlier that this isn't an introduction to animal rights thought. There is a more argumentative purpose here. So in the next chapter, after your intellectual history, you offer your own conception of animal rights, or you start to push towards your own conception of animal rights. So let me ask you, what do you think animal rights are?
I think of rights particularly as very strong moral constraints, as the kind of moral constraints that are more important than other kinds of considerations, particularly, for example, non-moral considerations. Some things that when we're trying to decide what to do, we're going to weigh up a load of different considerations. So, for example, if you're designing a benefit system and you're a politician, you've got to weigh up whether or not your system is efficient or focused on rights protections, right? You might be thinking that people have a right to certain benefits, but if you were to grant all of the rights that people have, you might end up with a very inefficient system, right? You might have to, for example, allow a large amount of fraud or something like that, or a bit of wastage. And the rights position says the rights concern is more important than the efficiency consideration. You don't sacrifice rights for the sake of efficiency or something like that. I also think rights trump other kinds of considerations. They're more important than other kinds of considerations, and some of those are moral. Right? There are moral concerns that are not rights-based, like generosity, charity, kindness. Those are all things that are good, morally good, praiseworthy things, but rights might trump them. So if I'm trying to save someone's life, I can do away with politeness or some other kinds of consideration like that. I might break an agreement with a friend. I might violate a norm of friendship to rescue someone because they have a right that needs protecting or something like that. So they're very weighty considerations that overcome other sorts of considerations, and they ought to be represented in terms of legal constraints, right, that justify coercive measures to enable them. So the thing that really defines a right for me and makes it connected with political morality and with justice is they describe enforceable constraints. If you're not respecting someone's right, then another person, such as the person whose right is being violated, may use force, coercion, to ensure that duty that you have, their right is protected.
How much room do you think there is for intellectual diversity and disagreement within animal rights? And specifically, I'm thinking about the animals in farms, homes, zoos, and labs that you talk about in the book, in the case studies chapter. So, for example, do you think there's room for support for animal testing within animal rights thought, or will animal rights necessarily have to rule out those kinds of activities?
Yeah, so I think the thing that justifies animal rights is the fact that they can feel, that they have a subjective experience of the world, that they have emotions, they can suffer, they can feel pleasure and happiness, and some of them can feel more complex emotions like grief, love, maybe jealousy, anger, fear. Those are the things that justify the rights, that underpin them in the same way that I think they underpin human rights. So I think the question actually depends on the kinds of interests that an animal has. So I think diversity is difficult in that case, right? If an animal has an interest in not suffering, a disagreement on whether it's okay to make it suffer within a rights tradition is going to be on fairly weak foundations. I think it's not going to get off the ground very much. Now, we might get some reasonable disagreement within traditions, right? If you're a utilitarian philosopher, I can see how you can make a reasoned argument in favor of maximizing the amount of goodness in the world, the amount of happiness in the world. Maybe that permits some degree of causing suffering, either to humans or animals. And I mean, that's one reason why I'm not a utilitarian, right? But I can see it, that's a reasonable disagreement that people can have over a moral framework. I struggle to see that within a rights framework, although you might have scope if you have, there are different conceptions of rights, right? Some of those are balancing conceptions of rights, but they tend to, all of them, rule out, except in the most extreme circumstances, sacrificing an individual's most important interests for the sake of a collective good. We won't allow people's fundamental interest in not suffering or being killed just to be sacrificed for improving well-being of the community, except in a really dire emergency, a war or a natural disaster or something like that. And that's where questions about justice tend to go out the window, right? Special circumstances. But in our day-to-day life, I think there's limited room for disagreement in that kind of thing. I think there is plenty of scope for disagreement over other sorts of issues, like whether or not we ought to permit the ownership of animals as companion animals or something like that. Ethics is really difficult. I think that's the defining feature of moral philosophy. It's incredibly difficult, and the people who are doing it are imperfect. We're not perfect reasoners. We don't have infinite time. We don't have all of the information. We make mistakes. So there's got to be scope for us to have disagreement, because we could be wrong, and we have to acknowledge that. So I see plenty of scope for us disagreeing about the kinds of rights that animals have, the strength of particular rights. People might disagree about whether death is bad for particular animals or not, and have scope for reasoned disagreement in those areas. But there are some questions that are much more easily settled, I think, from a rights perspective.
So I suppose what I'm getting at is, if we're serious about animal rights, there are an awful lot of things that are quite routine now that we're going to have to basically entirely rule out. Mm-hmm. And by that, I suppose I'm saying animal rights is by its nature quite radical.
Oh, extremely radical, yes. It is going to change our society in ways that are they're quite difficult to imagine. So you think about the ways in which we use animal products, it's astonishing. And most people don't realise, most vegans don't realise the extent to which animals are used. I've been a vegan for more than 20 years, coming on 25 years, and it's only in the last few years that I realised that toilet roll has gelatin in it, for example. We have tallow in our banknotes. If you're an artist, right, you've got to worry about shellac in your inks, animal hair in your paintbrushes. Arts and crafts, you might find your threads are made of silk, and there's all sorts of stuff that just, it's really hard to address. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that, if we outlawed all of that, right, we banned the use of animal products or products derived from suffering and killing, most of us probably wouldn't notice very much, because the replacements we'd use are going to be very similar, right? It's very rare that I can't find an analog or a product that's almost identical. When I started being vegan, it was difficult. Now it's really easy because technology is advanced, because the marketplace has made it easier. Most of us will be able to experience quite a lot of changes without actually changing our behavior. It's radical in some respects, but it might not mean the society looks all that different from the one we've got now in quite a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. Chapter 6 is about emerging issues, and this chapter, I think, was one of the things that, for me, told me that this was a book written right now by someone involved in the debates, rather than just something that was reflecting upon years of animal ethics. For example, it strikes me that the questions that you raise about insects and other invertebrates are some of the toughest that we face in animal rights theory. So what's your take on these?
I mean, yeah, I think this is one of the areas where I think you start to see that philosophy is not only a practical discipline, right? It's about how do we live our lives. That's why I do it anyway. I want to know the answers to those questions. What should I do? But it's also an interdisciplinary project a lot of the time. We're relying on the kind of evidence that comes from other disciplines, and in this case, from science. We have a question when we say non-human animals should be owed rights, and those rights stem from their interests, and the interests come from being sentient. But we don't know the answer to the question, which animals are sentient, which creatures are sentient. We can say what sentience is, but we need scientists to tell us which animals have sentience. And the latest kind of research suggests that lots of animals we didn't think were sentient for a very long time are sentient to some degree, or likely sentient. And that started quite a while ago, 10, 20 years ago, with questions about fish sentience. It's Victoria Braithwaite's book, Do Fish Feel Pain? Really interesting bit of research, lots of research since then. And that's moved into invertebrates, crustaceans, mollusks, lots of interesting recent emerging research that says maybe creatures like bees can feel something. They make what are known as motivational trade-offs, right? They'll sacrifice some of their well-being in order to gain a reward, and they'll make decisions about that. Their mental capacities are more complicated and sophisticated than we'd realized. And that raises some really serious ethical problems, not least because we farm a lot of insects for animal protein to feed farm animals, livestock, and because that market is pretty much saturated, insect farmers have started trying to market insect protein to humans, partly because it has a much lower carbon footprint potentially than the livestock people have been eating, so it fulfills some of those carbon requirements. It might be a route out of the kind of climate catastrophe that animal agriculture is pushing us towards. But if it turns out those insects can feel, then we might be violating rights, or if we're utilitarians, we might be causing an awful lot of suffering. And that's worrying. So my view is, well, we don't need to eat them. Right? It's not a necessary thing that we do so. And it always amazes me the steps that people, primarily men, will go to avoid eating vegetables. You could eat some lentils. No, they scream, we'd rather eat bugs. So that strikes me as puzzling. And the second thing is, I think it's better to take a precautionary attitude towards these kind of things. We might be wrong. They might not feel very much at all. But if we're mistaken, if they can feel, then the potential amount of suffering we cause is very high. And the loss to us is very low from not eating them. So I think we're probably better off taking that precautionary approach. And the second reason, I think, is about our own psychology. And I noticed this myself after I became vegan. I started off as vegetarian, and I found it much easier to be vegan. I found it much easier to set strict lines. this is one I'm not willing to cross. I'm just going to eat plants and other non-animal products. And it was easier to maintain the kind of discipline than when I had lots of edge cases. What about eggs? What about cheese? I think it's easier to do that when you just cut out all animal products. So I think there's a sort of easier not to make compromises sometimes that can erode your moral principles. So I think it's safer to stay on the plant side of things. And it may turn out, morally speaking, insects, certain mollusks don't have rights, shouldn't have rights. Just being strict about it could make maintaining your moral principles easier.
Do you worry about the prospect that there might be hundreds of billions or trillions or hundreds of trillions of rights-bearing beings out there? Do you think that makes justice very difficult to achieve?
Yes, it might do. I mean, particularly certain kinds of justice, right? Very difficult to live your life without causing harm. And although I can imagine a very different world from our own, I think the burdens associated with some ways of living, like take for instance the sort of Jainist approach, really strict Jainist approach, that'd be a really burdensome, difficult life for us to lead, particularly with the kind of population levels that we have. It's a lot to ask of people. So that's one worry. And the other worry is kind of questions of distributive justice. If non-human animals are owed justice, and part of that means a fair distribution of the burdens and benefits that come with living socially, not just this things like resource distribution, but rights and other kind of social benefits. If we're distributing those amongst a wider population and not just humans, then that becomes, it might be that we spread out resources so thinly that nobody has enough to live a flourishing life, and that we end up with some very difficult moral problems. I mean, if some beings have a very limited set of interests and others have a very rich set of interests, and we've got to distribute between billions with a very, very limited set of interests and a smaller number with very rich set of interests, they're really complicated calculations to make. It might just be beyond us to do that fairly. So I worry about those kind of problems, yes. But I also think some of those are a long way away from us. Right, we're better off making some movement towards a slightly better state of affairs than we are in now, than getting paralysed thinking about the really tricky ones much further down the line.
You've mentioned imagination several times, and that is something that I associate with you and your work, unlike, say, intellectual history, which we were talking about before. So what do you think is the role of imagination for animal rights?
I think all of our ethical behaviour requires the use of imagination. When we're deliberating over what to do, we're imagining what we ought to do. We've got a range of possibilities. I could do this or I could do that. And we've got to choose between them, and that requires us to picture it somehow. When we're thinking about what a world would look like or should look like, we're using our imagination. It's just an intrinsic part of thinking morally. And part of our job is to help people, I think, as philosophers and other kind of humanities and social sciences academics, to imagine those possibilities, to give people the tools. So, for example, philosophically, the kind of tools that we need to do the kind of moral thinking are conceptual, right? What concepts do we need to think about justice and to make our ethical decisions? Concepts like rights, duties, citizenship, justice, all of those, democracy, right? Those are all freedom, equality. They're all important moral concepts, and they can be quite often difficult to apply in the case of non-human animals. What way do we think of non-human animals in terms of their status, their moral status? Are they equal? What does freedom look like for a chimpanzee? Can a cat be a citizen? And that's part of, I think, the role that we have, is to help either say whether these concepts fit. Can they be adapted? Do they work? And if they work, then that means that we can use our existing political institutions and apply them. And that makes that something that people go, oh, no, actually, this isn't just a ridiculous, fanciful idea. I can see, oh yeah, and there was that sort of famous, I think it's Bertrand Russell quote, votes for oysters, right? It's a strange reductio, a criticism of animal rights that oysters might end up with votes, but as philosophers, we can start thinking about whether that really is ridiculous, right? maybe oysters don't have votes or shouldn't have votes, but maybe their interests, if they have them, ought to be represented. And how would they be represented? Someone could act on their behalf and cast a vote for the oysters. And we now have a situation where rivers and forests and mountains have been granted legal standing in some jurisdictions, Canada, New Zealand, India. Natural entities might have legal representation, and people have a constitutional role, a guardianship role, to represent them in political debates, all using those existing concepts that we've got. So I think part of our role is to show how that can work and to develop concepts so that they can work in that way. And that's imaginative.
Well, let me ask the big question. You've given us a book. Can you give us a sentence? What are animal rights for?
God, you've really given me the difficult questions now. I've had to use 35,000 words to answer that, Josh. I think they're to protect the most fundamental interests of non-human animals.
Now, Steve, you're a returning guest on Knowing Animals. It's the second time you've been here, so we have our 4 quick questions for you this week. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
I am indeed.
What for you has been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I think it's the fact that I'm finally being able to sort of answer practical questions that have bothered me. I have the freedom. I get paid to be a student, and I got into this because I had questions. I didn't know how to act, and I wanted answers. And now I have the time and the space to sit and think really carefully about my own moral behaviour, about what the right thing to do is, and then to be able to share that with other people who are struggling in the same sort of ways. It's very satisfying.
And then on the flip side, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research for you?
I think probably it's seeing research about how people respond to arguments. Moral psychology of humans is very interesting, and people will engage in all sorts of rationalization and self-deception, willful ignorance, to avoid thinking carefully and changing their behavior. And so sometimes you doubt the power of argument, philosophy, thinking to really change the world. So I think, that's been pretty disheartening.
And my next question is in some ways one of the hardest I ever ask, but it's your chance to give a shout out to an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of. And it could be an emerging scholar, someone who's written in a field but has not received the attention they deserve, someone writing in an adjacent field, someone writing in another language, just someone who you think we should be paying attention to, but maybe we aren't.
I'm going to apologise now in advance, Josh. I'm going to give you 3 names. I'm sorry. I'm really greedy. The first 2 are 2 of my PhD students whose work I think is fantastic. They're much more thoughtful, cleverer people than I am. And there's Will Gildier and Susie Pickett. Will's doing really interesting work on moral status, thinking about questions of moral hierarchy and comparisons of moral standing between humans and non-humans and different kinds of animals. And Susie's working on questions of moral psychology and what makes people vegan and stops them being vegan and all the kinds of questions around that. I think absolutely fascinating research. And then the third person I want to mention is Catherine Oliver, who's doing sociology and geography based in Lancaster. And she's working on another book in the series that mine's published in. She's doing What is Veganism For? And that should be published next year. That looks set to be a really interesting book as well. So I recommend going out and buying that. Good thing about this series is they're cheap. They're not like those academic books where you go online, you go, 120 quid? I'm not paying that. These are aimed at the public, so they're very affordable.
Are you optimistic about the future of human-non-human animal relations?
Yes and no. Right? So I mean, I'm a little worried at the moment because studying the history of animal rights, you can see that periods of turmoil and conflict and scarcity are often periods when things are set back, animal welfare is set back, people are focused on their own homes and their own well-being, and they're frightened. So right now it seems like there's a sort of a little cost of living crisis, there's wars, there's conflict, and people are taking a step back. But the overall progress, I think, has been generally positive. We're moving in the right direction, and technology is really advancing. I mean, I'm kind of happy and sad about it at the same time. I think technological advances like cultured meat and changes in farming will allow people to just radically change the world without changing their moral behaviour at all. We're likely to shift away from animal agriculture whilst keeping meat and not do it for any of the right reasons. We'll probably do it because it's more efficient, or it's cheaper, or it benefits us, not because we care about non-human animals for their sakes. We still get to the right place, maybe, or near it. So optimistic with a sort of cautious note there.
What are you working on next?
So I'm trying to write a book that I've been trying to write for ages, which is all about sort of animal rights activism. So it's the challenges that activists face in their lives. So all of the problems, if you think that animals have rights, what should you do? How should you maintain friendships with people who, for example, don't subscribe to the same views as you, if they're meat eaters? Should you rescue animals? Should you break the law? What kind of protests are you permitted to engage in? How should you regard your fellow citizens? Should you think of the state as having legitimacy, even though it's violating rights on a massive scale? All of those kind of problems. Really difficult things. Should you blame people for their attitudes in a world that sees meat eating as perfectly normal and permissible? Yeah, all the tricky stuff.
How can people find out more about your work?
I guess the best place is to look, just to Google my name with Leicester University next to it and have a look at my university profile page.
Well, thanks so much, Steve, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, and we're also on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. I'm also on Blue Sky, whatever that is, so if you are too, let's connect. And please do spread the word about Knowing Animals and review the podcast where you found it. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.